The economic adjustment program that President Carlos Andrés Pérez tried to apply in Venezuela in '89 usually receives great public interest. However, a few years later, an economic reform program of the same magnitude was carried out, which is usually talked about less. Such program was the controversial Agenda Venezuela, promoted in the second government of President Rafael Caldera. The recurring instability that intensified in the '80s and '90s in the country demanded drastic changes in the system, not only financial but also political and institutional. The Great Turn, or the so-called package of Carlos Andrés Pérez in '89, was a first failed proposal to promote a new model in Venezuela, the Calderazo. The coups of '92, the financial debacle, and the forced resignation of the president of the nation presented us with the first great Republican crisis of partisan democracy. In this scenario, Dr. Rafael Caldera assumes the presidency of the country in 1994. With the pocketbooks of Venezuelans and big business being one of the most pressing issues. During his administration, Caldera carried out a unique economic reform program that, contrary to his campaign promises, marked the last years of the century in Venezuela and the prelude to the arrival of Chavismo in the country. This is Ronaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to follow us on our Instagram account, which you can find below this video. Venezuela, filled with intrigues and mysteries in all national orders, welcomes the year 1994, with another figure from the old politics who was brought back to the country's public life as a presidential candidate. We're talking about Dr. Rafael Caldera, who, according to some, took advantage of the latest and traumatic events in the nation to gain political advantage. While for others, he was a veteran who had come to put order in the government. The Venezuelan economic picture was worthy of study. The country had gone through several decades of economic prosperity and fiscal stability since the 20s. However, starting from the 80s, all macroeconomic variables began to deteriorate. Inflation, public debt, real productivity, fiscal stability, and international reserves were all in the red. The Great Turnaround, or the so-called '89 package, was not successful in fully addressing this crisis. A few years later, candidate Rafael Caldera, in his election campaign, supported by left-wing parties, defended the banners of social justice and condemned the so-called package dealers, opposing any macroeconomic adjustment program and abrupt decision-making in economic matters, because for him it was necessary, quote, an economy at the service of man. But beyond the rhetoric typical of propaganda, wasn't there a logical and technical basis that provided clarity on what his government plan was? He was critical of the technicians of Carlos Andrés' economic program and said that, I open quotes again, "The theory is not enough. It is necessary to understand the reality of the country," close quotes. In this way, he managed to capitalize on the majority of the supports, which made Caldera the second president of the republic to be elected twice. But the heat of the electoral words would be far from the governmental practice of Caldera's second term. The economic collapse would continue, and it would sweep away the campaign promises. On February 2nd, 1994, Dr. Rafael Caldera takes possession of the presidency of the Republic for the second time. Caldera was elected as part of a coalition of left-wing parties and other trends outside the hegemonic bloc of AD and COPE, which had dominated for the last 30 years. However, this coalition, nicknamed Chiri Pero, lacked a majority in the legislative power. A similar scenario to the one Carlos Andrés Pérez had in '89. Caldera's government had to face the structural fiscal deficit generated in previous governments. Also an inflation of 44%, as recorded in 1993. Added to the stagnation of the country's productive apparatus, which implied a decrease in the purchasing power of the Venezuelan. The price of oil was trading at more than $12.3 per barrel. To mitigate the serious scenario, the program called Plan Sosa was immediately conceived, which sought a substantial reform of the tax system, with measures such as the creation of CENIAT. The policy of austerity in public image and financial administration was what was present during the 5 years of presidency. Maduro's simple inauguration contrasted with Carlos Andrés Pérez's lavish ceremony at the Teresa Carreño. The public budget of 1994 was cut by 10%, and the presidency's by 15% as immediate measures. However, the government did not seem to be prepared for the crisis in the financial system that was about to come. The controversial banking crisis of 1994 in Venezuela was an episode to which we will dedicate a special program. This banking crisis was a period of widespread insolvency of several of the country's main banks. That is, they did not have the money to meet all obligations to their customers. This crisis began to arise in January of 1994 with the departure of Banco Latino from the clearinghouse. And it had its first manifestation with a massive bank run in early February, where tens of thousands of savers tried to withdraw their funds from the bank as quickly as possible. Then the state had to deliver significant sums of money to assist these insolvent banks, to the point of nationalizing some of them. This situation implied a scenario of conflict and recession in banking activity and national commercial activity, which seriously affected half of the country's financial system for several years and resulted in the sinking and collapse of the main banking entities. The causes and development of the events of this banking debacle will be explained in depth in a future video. The fact is that the entire private economy payment system was put at risk. The Central Bank of Venezuela had information warning of this crisis, but no preventive action was taken. Even some critics of Caldera point out that there was a political agenda in the way the banking crisis was handled, highlighting that the great victim of all these events were the savers of the nation's financial system, that is, the common Venezuelan, who lost part of their wealth. The banking crisis, due to its structural characteristics and the impact on capital flight in the country, led to the implementation of a new exchange control that resulted in the subsequent bankruptcy of thousands of companies, in addition to the suspension of constitutional guarantees in an episode known as the Calderazo, which was a package of measures that were taken on July 22, 1994. The country's Congress, in opposition to these actions and suspensions of guarantees, decides to restore constitutional guarantees. But again, the presidency decreed a suspension of the same, and even invited the public opinion to a consultative referendum to ratify his measures, deploying in this way a vigorous rhetoric that categorized as banking mafias all those who had been accomplices of these episodes of economic instability. According to Caldera, the suspension of guarantees sought to enable the confiscation of the assets of all those belonging to such banking mafias, as well as the detection of drug trafficking, speculation, and hoarding activities. Just like providing the executive power with the essential elements to safeguard the stability of the country's economic, social, and political system. However, many critics describe these events as an overreach of the president's functions. With the ninth plan of the nation, launched a few months ago and its scarce results, the SOSA second plan was designed. A program designed to create 12 measures that already added elements of an initial economic stabilization package and an anti-inflationary scheme. This plan contemplated the Budget Evaluation Commission with the aim of reducing public spending for the year 1996, the partial reform of the income tax law, setting tax reductions for citizens in certain instances, the creation of a tax on commercial transactions, the reform to the organic customs law, the implementation of the control and management system for public finances, among other measures. However, this plan did not receive the desired reception from the political class and national public life. By the year 1995, the nation's fiscal deficit was around $10 billion. The truth is that the execution of the SOSA-I and SOSA second plans encountered a significant number of obstacles. Like the so-called social costs that were warned in the public debate that were going to be generated if these measures were taken, social costs, which in the end ended up showing that everything was reduced to an agenda of commitments and sympathies around the political party establishments. According to the criteria of numerous experts during the short application of these plans, the interests of the high political business spheres were privileged, to the detriment of a real stabilization of the economy. The plans had partial achievements that would even be perceived later on. But the failures of the policymakers, whether due to ignorance, omission, or complicity, threw overboard any noble intention to stabilize the Venezuelan economy. The macroeconomic variables at play were still out of control, reserves were at a minimum, and the recently imposed exchange control was already showing wear, accompanied by a serious discrediting of the institutional and democratic system of the republic. Military rumors, political rumors, even rumors about the state and health of Caldera. They presented a picture that demanded drastic measures, and the government was a prisoner of its campaign rhetoric against the package dealers. In this way, the conceptualization of the program begins, known as the Venezuela Agenda, a new deep reform program that would later be represented in a package of stabilization measures backed by the International Monetary Fund. For the Venezuela Agenda, the economist, political leader, and former guerrilla Teodoro Pekov was incorporated into the Cortaplan portfolio, a sort of planning ministry of Rafael Caldera, with Pekov becoming the leading exponent around the implementation of this new program. More than a technical objective, with Pekov the aim was to politically articulate the execution of the Venezuela Agenda. Pekov's political and subversive trajectory during the guerrilla years and his subsequent academic, political, and legislative career were well known. In this seemingly paradoxical way, we had a prominent socialist leading the economic liberalization plan of a prominent social Christian, in turn supported by a coalition of left-wing parties. The incorporation of PECOF was perceived as strategic by the population and power actors, which allowed the achievement of some initial results. His phrase is well remembered when he was asked how the Venezuela agenda was going, and he replied, "We are doing badly, but we are doing well." The agenda included implementing a set of measures suggested by the International Monetary Fund. As a requirement for the Caldera government to receive a loan from this institution, these measures, which like with Carlos Andres were not fully implemented, contemplated a tax increase and a general tax reform, liberation of the exchange rate and subsequent evaluation of the bolivar, liberation of interest rates in gasoline and public service rates, a reopening of the oil and energy sector to private companies, the privatization of deficit public companies, greater austerity in public spending and compensatory social programs. The Venezuela agenda was applied relatively consistently from 96 to 98, so it had a short life. It's important to note that the Venezuela agenda completely contradicted the electoral campaign promises. It began to be applied without the tensions and strong resistances that previous adjustment programs did have, and also without generating high social unrest. A difference of this program with the policies of the Great Turnaround was that it remained within a scheme of broad communication and dissemination, a matter that enabled better public acceptance of the measures. However, the program did not have the consistency and continuity that was aspired to, also interrupted later with the arrival of President Hugo Chavez to power. About some of its results, it can be pointed out that 99% inflation in the year 1996. It decreases to 50% in the year 97, and then it ends at levels of 35%. In 1998, reaching 16% in 2000. This being an effect of the decisions taken from which the next administration would benefit with President Hugo Chavez. Regarding the figures for economic reactivation, although the economy slowed down in 96, then in 97 and 98, the gross domestic product remained reaching a record average of 7.8 and 7.6%. This as a result of the measures of this program, especially due to the process of reopening oil to private capital, as well as a better fiscal and tax administration. This being one of the few redeemable elements of the SOSA-I plan, the income per capita rose from $12,300 in 1994 to $12,600 in 1998. Oil production resumed an upward path, going from 2.6 million barrels per day in 1994 to 3.3 million barrels per day in 1998. Various economists claim that conditions were being created to establish a production close to 5 million barrels per day in the coming years. International reserves, for their part, also recovered from $9,700 million in 95 to $17,800 million in 1997. According to experts, the credit requested from the International Monetary Fund was not used in its entirety and was paid in advance. Additionally, the Macroeconomic Stabilization Fund is created. Now, even though non-oil exports increased, according to scholars on the subject, the policies of the Venezuela agenda also led to further deindustrialization of the country, which Venezuelans would pay a high price for years later. One of the most serious problems to address then was the fiscal deficit present in the national economic structure. Subsidies, overreaching regulations, and excessive public spending did not allow for good economic performance or the management of public income. To correct this situation, among other things, it was necessary to eliminate the subsidy present in the exchange rate from the bolivar to the dollar, since the dollar was artificially cheap. As a result of the exchange controls assumed in '96, the unofficial market contemplated 450 bolivars per dollar, while the government maintained the official exchange rate at 290 bolivars per dollar. It was also planned to reduce public spending, increase the sales tax rate, and adjust the prices of public services that were generating losses and imbalances. In this way, the exchange rate was finally freed and adjusted, and the bolivar was devalued. Likewise, sales taxes were increased, interest rates were freed, and price controls that persisted until then were eliminated. The aim was to clarify and stabilize macroeconomic variables. All of this helped achieve a fiscal surplus, meaning that the state received more money than it spent in '96 and '97. Although these measures, especially devaluation, strengthened the state more, which earned in dollars, to the detriment of the national private sector, which earned in bolivars. Petróleos de Venezuela, Sociedad Anónima, now received more bolivars for every dollar sold to the central bank, which implied a higher payment of taxes to the national treasury. Although this also meant a more expensive dollar for the citizens. This deficit reduction was also helped by the increase in oil prices during those years. This state reform project also involved the privatization of various companies, sectors, and activities, which reduced certain state burdens and opened the doors to greater fiscal discipline. However, it was a timid privatization like that of Carlos Andrés. All these measures increased state revenues by 170% more, and with that, the public administration benefited. In turn, an ever-increasing monetary liquidity in the early '97, which threatened with higher inflation, was efficiently mitigated with the issuance of stabilization bonds by the Central Bank of Venezuela. Likewise, the external debt decreased to a relative level at $23 billion, and non-traditional exports reached a historic level of $7.2 billion. Additionally, the tripartite agreement is produced to renew the payment and compensation scheme of Social Security, as well as the creation of pension funds. This implied an agreement between the business, government, and union sectors, which was rated as successful. It can be highlighted that the salaries of public employees remained above the price level, and the minimum wage was considered the second in Latin America, higher than $183 per month, higher than $183 per month. Despite the crisis, after decades of prosperity, the Venezuelan economy maintained its superiority over many other countries on the continent. Additionally, as part of the Venezuela agenda, social and compensatory programs were created, such as PROVAL, a food and supply program, SUMED, a medication supply program, and the Social Strengthening Fund for the development of productive projects in communities, in conjunction with organized civil society. Also noteworthy is the school feeding program called PAE for the year 1998. The Asian tigers crisis arises, and with it, the price of a barrel of oil drops to $9.3 per barrel. This implied a significant contraction of public administration revenues, for which the government decides to lower public administration salaries by 10%. Despite some measures taken, international reserves dropped to $14.8 billion that year. With a presidential term that was about to end, and with the upcoming arrival to power of a figure who promised to change everything, the country's economic policy passed into new hands and the Venezuela Agenda program came to an end. Despite all these actions at the macroeconomic level, and although there was not the strong opposition that there was against Carlos Andrés' great turn, Rafael Caldera's reform process was applied irregularly and late, also pushed by an unprecedented banking crisis. Faced with an extremely difficult Venezuelan socio-political reality and hindered by all kinds of interests, leaving open the possibility of new crises in the future. The program yielded favorable short- and medium-term results for the country's financial stabilization. At the same time, it harmed various sectors of the national industry, especially those unrelated to the oil sector. The challenge in Venezuela has always been to correct its old structural problems through viable actions that are truly designed for our unique and singular reality. In economics, which is inherently rooted in culture and politics, this program did not establish bases that would promote a substantial change in the model, not only at the economic level, but of all kinds. It was insufficient to correct or mitigate the fundamental problems that Venezuela has historically dragged. So its results, positive or negative, were left in uncertainty with the arrival of the Fifth Republic movement to power. For these reasons, it can be highlighted that the Venezuela Agenda program, while effective, taking short-term measures and managing the economic problems of the moment, as well as traumatic and surprising events of nature, it did not meet its last and most important objective. With which one? Even some experts point out that it would have been possible to establish the necessary institutional conditions which could have prevented the political events that were to come, already known to posterity. Thank you for watching this video. If you haven't done so, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, your appreciations, your suggestions. Like this and all other videos, hit the bell so you get notifications of all our posts. And of course, follow us on our Instagram account, where we post supplementary material to everything we do on this channel. See you next time. Take care.